Syria, where UK aid might be cut by 67%, according to leaked documents seen by this programme, obtained by Open Democracy. When COVID hit here, the few job prospects that did exist disappeared. But UK taxpayers' money has supported a mask-making scheme for unemployed women like Abdo. The masks she makes help save lives and has given her a job. In war-torn Yemen, which is facing humanitarian disaster, reducing UK aid could be devastating. A letter sent to the government from more than 100 UK charities warns history will not judge us kindly.
The families that we're supporting tell us that without that support, they don't know how they will feed their children. And that programme is due to end in June. And with the announced funding cuts, we don't know what's going to happen next. So the situation is really very critical.
It means that aid workers will have to make the difficult choices of cutting aid. Cutting aid to which communities? Which districts will we stop aid? Which children will we sadly allow to die? We must not give up on these communities. We cannot let them down.
The UK government says it wants to reduce by a third the billions we spend every year supporting projects like this education programme in Rwanda. Back in 1970, the United Nations set a target for rich countries to spend 0.7% of their gross national income on aid. The UK became the first G7 country to do so under a Conservative Prime Minister.
I believe this commitment is in Britain's long-term interests.
In 2015, the target was made law. In 2019, it was reaffirmed in the Tory election manifesto. Last summer, as the pandemic hit, the aid budget was cut, although the 0.7% target was retained, until November, when it was dropped by the Chancellor.
During a domestic fiscal emergency, sticking rigidly to spending 0.7% of our national income on overseas aid is difficult to justify to the British people.
Justifications. The government says the nation's coffers are so stretched at the moment, it can't even give nurses a decent pay rise. And Charity Begins at Home is supposed to play well with traditional Conservative values and red wall voters. But not all Tory backbenchers agree.
When I go out and speak to my constituents on this issue, I talk about the vaccine programs, I talk about getting women into education, I talk about initiatives that I chair, like preventing sexual violence.
And what do your constituents say to you then?
Well, lots of them are very pro because they see the value. They see the international community gathering together to be able to work on issues, whether it be in Syria, Somalia, Libya, or elsewhere. And they see that value. And I think they see that as a value of soft power.
Water distribution in Somalia, another project supported by UK funding. The government says they're still deciding the future of individual programmes and no decisions have been made yet. The UK's 0.7% aid commitment is still enshrined in law, which means if it is to be slashed to the mooted 0.5%, temporarily or for good, it needs to go before Parliament for debate and, of course, a vote. But nothing has been timetabled yet.
Well, in a moment, we'll be speaking to the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Lisa Nandy. But first joining me is the Conservative MP, Andrew Bridgen. Mr. Bridgen, welcome to the programme. When you hear 100 charities say that history will not judge us kindly for cutting aid to Yemen, what do you have to say to those charities?
Well, if they look at the record of the last Labour government, the left are now screaming about this reduction in the aid budget. The last Labour government was in government for 13 years, never hit 0.7% of GDP for the aid budget once. In fact, only ever hit 0.5% twice. The aid budget at 0.7 was sold to me as a Conservative on the basis that it would encourage other developed nations to increase their aid budget to match us. History has shown that that is not the case. And there are more options open to us now that we've left the European Union with targeted free trade agreements and special trade deals with developing countries where we can create sustainable economic growth for those countries, something that was never available to us where we didn't have access to trade, not aid.
Yeah, well, as you say, this is a Conservative government. Let's forget about the left for a second. In Brexit Britain, we want to portray the image that we are global. This isn't sending out the right message about Britain's reputation, is it?
Well, of course it is, because that we've put huge amounts of money into developing a vaccine where all the research costs have been covered by the UK government, AstraZeneca, available for the world, an effective vaccine, £3 a dose. The UK government have put the biggest donation to COVAX initiative to offer affordable vaccines, available vaccines to 180 developing nations around the world, £548 million, and we're encouraging other countries to join in with that.
Okay, I get that, but when we hear that millions of people will starve in Yemen and be thrust into even deeper poverty, what can you say to the people? Do you not think that we have a moral obligation to people of Yemen?
Well, we've sat out at 0.7% of GDP, as you said, the first country in the G7 to do so. No one's come and matched us. We cannot shoulder the whole burden of the world on our shoulders. We are delivering them a vaccine which is going to be easily usable at not at -80 like the Pfizer vaccine and £24 a dose. And we're going to use the aid budget we've got of £10 billion, a huge amount of money, to provide free vaccines around the world. And we're going to probably have to bail out our neighbours who've badly mismanaged their own vaccine procurement, even in the European Union.
Okay, let's not go to the EU. Let's not talk about them for a second. Your colleague Tobias Ellwood, another Conservative MP, says the consequences of these aid cuts will be extremism, terrorism, refugee crises, a migration impact and an impact on our security. If you don't accept a moral obligation, isn't there an obligation in a selfish way to say people will end up turning up in boats on the shores of Europe if we don't provide them with aid?
Well, we need to be having this conversation with the European Union. The average amount that they give in foreign aid is nothing like the budget that we've supported for the last 10 years and continue to support. And of course, they've completely failed on the vaccine rollout. We'll have to bail them out as well.
OK, Andrew Bridgen, thanks for joining us. Let's turn now to the Shadow Foreign Secretary, Lisa Nandy. Lisa Nandy, you could hear what Andrew Bridgen was saying there. He points out that we can't shoulder the burden of the whole world on our shoulders. How do you respond to that?
Well, he's absolutely right that the scale of need out there is so great that we need to work with allies in order to deliver real assistance to people in countries like Yemen, widely regarded, including by our own government, as the world's worst humanitarian catastrophe. But if you look around the world, that's precisely what's happening. The UK is not alone in providing aid. Other countries closer to home, like Germany, or further afield, like the United States, are stepping up and stepping forwards. And it really is a tragedy that at the moment that the United States, one of our chief allies, is back in the game and is stepping up, we are stepping back. This is not what global Britain was meant to stand for. It is a disaster for the people of Yemen and many of those countries that we now learn have been fingered for large cuts, like Syria and Lebanon. But it is also a disaster for the British people.
Okay.
We have an opportunity to work with our allies, opportunity to go out into the world and make it a safer place for all of us.
Okay.
And the government has squandered that opportunity.
Sorry to interrupt you, but we are short on time. The UK government would point out that we have a huge vaccination programme which we intend to share with poorer countries. Isn't that enough?
I think it's absolutely right that we work together to get the vaccine rolled out. The government was right to get it rolled out quickly to people here, and that programme is still ongoing, and also to make sure that we work with other countries to get it rolled out overseas, because they know that until everybody is vaccinated, none of us are safe from the threat of COVID. But the same is also true of aid spending more generally. It's one of the reasons why Tobias Ellwood, who you quoted, who is chair of the Defence Committee, can see the folly of what the government is doing. Many of the programmes that have been cut so far are programmes that are aimed at reducing the threat from terrorism to Britain. On Thursday, the Foreign Secretary said the threat from Daesh remains our greatest threat, both at home and abroad. And yet they're cutting aid in countries like Syria, which will be absolutely devastating in terms of helping to create the hopeless conditions in which many of those terrorist organisations can thrive. So on every level, morally, politically, legally,
okay.
And in terms of our role in the world, the government is in the wrong place on
Can
this.
I just put it to you, though, the problem you've got is that this is really popular. A YouGov poll, November 2020, suggested that 2/3 of Britons support cutting the foreign aid budget. How are you going to persuade them otherwise?
But I'm not completely sure, actually, that most of Parliament is totally out of step with the public. That was the beauty of 0.7% of GNI as an aid target, is that as the nation did better, we spent more, and as the nation could afford less, we spent less. And abandoning that seems to me to be the ultimate in fiscal irresponsibility. The truth is that we can afford to make sure that we get the vaccine rolled out to people across the world, and we can't afford not to, because the consequences for our national security, for our health security, we are an interconnected world. If COVID-19 has shown us anything, it's shown us that. And I think the government has really misjudged it.
Thank you very much, Lisa Nandy. Thanks for joining us.